All right, it's 6:30, and I'd like to call this July 6th, 2023 Sammamish Planning Commission meeting to order. First, I'll do roll call. Commissioner Saeed Safavian.
Here.
And Commissioner Carrie Bosworth.
Here.
Commissioner John Bachman.
Here.
And Commissioner Ajay Chakrapani.
Here.
And Commissioner Mark Bachman has an excused absence, and I'm Mike Bresco, and obviously I'm here. Jolene, would you read the meeting accessibility statement?
The public is welcome to attend Planning Commission meetings in person at City Hall, 801 228th Avenue Southeast, or virtually through Zoom. In accordance with the latest public health guidance, masks are recommended but not required for in-person attendance. Public comments. Each speaker is allowed up to 3 minutes for non-agenda comment, 5 minutes of representing an organization, and 7 minutes for agenda public comment. For those providing comment through Zoom, once you have dialed into the meeting, please virtually raise your hand to indicate you would like to provide public comment. Your mic will remain muted until you are called on during the public comment period. To give public comment via Zoom, join the webinar via the link https://us06 web.zoom.us/828-226-487-94. To give public comment via mobile or landline telephone, dial the following number, US +1 253-215-8782, webinar ID 828-226-487-94#.
Okay, and next is approval of this evening's agenda. Any modifications? Okay, seeing none, we'll consider the agenda approved by common consent. And next, approval of the minutes from the June 15th, 2023 regular meeting. Any modifications? Okay, seeing none, we'll consider the minutes from June 15th approved by common consent. And now we'll go to public comment, non-agenda items. So non-agenda will be things that are not related to land use and housing alternatives for the 2024 Comprehensive Plan Periodic Update. Julian, any people making comments?
Yes, we have, well, we had one hand raised. We currently have no hands raised. We now have one hand raised. Mr. Stickney, I will promote you to panelist.
Good evening, Planning Commissioners. Paul Stickney, Sammamish. I clicked twice, so I accidentally went on and off with my hand. Just to start quickly, awesome 4th of July celebration at the Plateau, at the Commons. Hope many of you got a chance to go. It was a really good event. And point of privilege, I'm not directly talking about the contents of the agenda packet that are up for discussion. I'm talking about a couple foundational things that were older in the process or not a part of the agenda pack tonight. And first, I would say that if you've had a chance to watch the City Council meeting on June the 13th, that was a 2.5-hour session on this topic, very informative. The comments I wanted to make tonight was about the, growth target process in Sammamish that's long over. It's not up for discussion to change it, but I do want to make aware, I attended all 10 or 12 of those meetings over 2 or 3 years, and the growth target that was adopted by the city did not factor in any internal needs within the community, nor affordable housing targets of the past, and further was referred to during the process as a minimum rather than a consistency number, which is now being touted, which is how the law was. So just want you to be aware of that. So Our target that we have in front of us today did not contemplate those things. But the other thing I'd like to talk about is also foundational. And I strongly suggest that the city get 6 number ranges. So we're tasked with meeting affordable housing from 0 to 30, 30 to 50, and 50 to 80. And what I'm talking about is what's the cost or the ratios in market rate housing when you mix in affordable? How do those numbers work? And then when we're not talking about market rate and going with bonus airspace where the land's not a component, there's still a cost to those categories. I think it would be extremely helpful to have the rough range of cost for those 6 categories to inform the conversations that we're having. So that's all I have tonight.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Julian, any other public comment?
And we have no more hands raised.
Okay. So next on the agenda is the land use and housing alternatives. Jeff Farengo, are you going to be doing a presentation?
Yes, I will be. Thank you.
Okay, well, we're looking forward to that.
Okay, appreciate it. Me too. I'm all set up. Let me just share my screen here. All right. Okay. Good evening, commissioners. Thanks for the opportunity to be here with you tonight. Jeff Arango, project manager for the consultant team on the comprehensive plan update. And we'll just go ahead and get started. So we have a lot of information to go through, and hopefully some of you did have a chance to take a look at at least part of the city council meeting just referenced by Mr. Stickney. This is a different version of that presentation. Some of the information is the same. Some has been updated based on some guidance that we've gotten from the Puget Sound Regional Council that kind of confirms some of our direction with regards to land use. So a couple of objectives for tonight. First, we want to understand the relationship between the growth target, the affordable housing allocation, which comes from King County and is something that's new for this periodic update that was not part of past efforts. The population projection, this is how many people we are expecting the population to increase by over the 20-year planning period. And this is something that's referenced specifically in the Growth Management Act, and it needs to be consistent throughout the entire plan. And then finally, the land capacity. This is the theoretical capacity for development in the city if every parcel that's available for development was developed. And we'll go through those terms in more specifics. We want to talk about the guidance from PSRC about planning for the growth target. We want to review our analysis of local housing opportunities and needs. We want to review the action alternative to ensure that we can accommodate the growth target and the affordable housing allocation, and we can get the plan certified by PSRC. We want to go through some of the different housing types that are options for the city to choose for compliance with HB 1110, which is the middle housing bill. And then finally, we want to review and provide input or seek input on the draft future land use map. So just a quick reminder that everything we're developing the plan really needs to feed into the vision. And the theme for this update is people, planet, and prosperity. And so we want to think about how we can advance those goals through the land use element and subsequently the other elements of the plan. So just wanted to remind the commission of the vision diagram and to be mindful of that as I go through some of the information tonight. So this diagram I've shown previously, but it really, I think, in some respects highlights some of the challenges of this periodic update. So there are many new requirements, not only to provide a certain amount of housing, also to provide a certain level of affordable housing and at deep affordability levels, which can be quite challenging. There's related state legislation that we need to comply with, HB 1110 and a number of other bills. Fortunately, I think Sammamish is in a good position to be able to comply, and we've already done some good thinking on it. So I think that's good. But part of the point I want to make is that we have a really relatively short amount of time to actually develop and adopt the plan and have it certified. And so, this is the opportunity to really set the stage for the next 20 years, but there's also some other things that may happen along the next, periods of time during the planning period that are also important. So things like sub-area planning, will not be directly part of developing the initial plan, but will be an important kind of early part of implementation. There's going to be some monitoring. There's a lot of assumptions that go into a comprehensive plan, but one thing I've learned from practicing planning over 20 years, it's really hard to predict the future. And so we need to be able to monitor and adjust if needed. And then, that gets into kind of the refinement part, making maybe some minor updates to the plan, making updates to zoning, development regs, things like that to make sure that everything is in alignment with our vision and our policies, goals, so on and so forth. So now I'd like to go over some of the really key land use terms, and it's really important to have a strong understanding of these terms and how they're used, because I think it's easy to use them interchangeably, and in some cases they're not. So the growth target, this is the growth targets originate from the Office of Financial Management, and there is a growth forecast for the whole state for 20 years. And I believe in rough numbers, the results of that is that Washington needs about 1 million homes. And so that growth target is then dispersed to the counties and is then dispersed to the cities. So if you take the collective growth target of all of the cities, that is theoretically all of the growth that we would anticipate to occur in the state during that period. Understanding, it's not an exact science, but that's kind of how it works. So therefore, there is some emphasis from the state and the region on really keeping your land use plan and subsequent elements, which I'll go into more detail in a moment, to the 2,100 units. So new this year is that not only do you get an allocation of a number of units, you actually get them broken down by income bands. And for Sammamish, the 2,100 units are all in the 0 to 80% or 0 to 50% AMI, which are, the most challenging units to produce. So not only do we have to provide capacity for the 2,100 units, we have to provide capacity for the affordable units. And some of those affordable units can only be provided in certain types of housing. For example, you wouldn't provide 0 to 30%, affordable housing in a single family home. The guidance from the state says that needs to be a mid-rise unit unless we can make a case for a different type of unit. So we have to get a little bit more nuanced in where our capacity is. So if we have a high requirement for affordable housing and all our capacity is in single family zones, then even though we might have enough capacity, it's not in the right spots. So that's just to give an example of how there's some new requirements this year that add complexity to it. The next is the population projection. So this is really what we base the comprehensive plan on. So this and the growth target. So if we are doing the capital facilities plan, for example, or the utilities plan, and we're estimating how much sewer capacity we need, we're generally going to be basing that off the growth target number. And that's a really important distinction. And so that's the population projection, is essentially taking the number of housing units, converting it to population using the household size, which I think is 2.75 in this case. That's your projection. We have a graph of that we'll show in a few moments. And then finally, development capacity. This is the amount of development that occur in the city if every parcel that is identified as having development potential. So that's still a relatively small number of parcels in the city. It takes out critical areas. There's a market factor because not every property is going to be for sale. You take out a portion of it if there's streets and infrastructure that get built. So it's a relatively conservative estimate. And that's your theoretical development capacity, but that's not necessarily what you would base your plan on. So you wouldn't do your capital facilities plan, your transportation plan, your utilities on that. So that is kind of the difference there. Okay, moving on, and we'll kind of reinforce some of these definitions as we move through the presentation with some different information and some other visuals. So this gets to a really key piece of information. This is something we previewed at the city council meeting, but we didn't quite have a definitive answer on this. based on just reading the guidance from this document. Subsequently, the city met with the Puget Sound Regional Council, which is the only entity in the region that certifies the plan. So in order to, be in compliance with the Growth Management Act, we do need to have that certified. And so one of the questions that we saw an answer to is, can we base our plan on more growth than the housing target? And when I say base the plan, I mean, can we plan transportation systems and infrastructure and capital facilities based on a higher assumed amount of growth than what the growth target is? And the answer that we got from them was a definitive no. You need to base your plan on the growth target of 2,100 units. The city presented some of the information that was part of the city council presentation previously in terms of our strategy around addressing local needs. They said, that's fine if you want to increase your capacity for development, but you really can't base your plan and those subsequent elements on it, which puts the city in a bit of a tricky spot, right? We can increase the capacity, but we don't necessarily have all the supporting plans to be able to accommodate that. So with that said, we've had to rethink our strategies a bit on the alternatives to really focus on developing an alternative that focuses on the growth target while accommodating for local needs through the capacity increases. So this is a revised slide from the city council meeting. And so the first one, these are some of the inputs that we're looking at into both the growth target as well as the land capacity. So the first one is the growth target and the affordable housing allocation. It's the 2,100 units. It forms the basis of our land use assumption. It forms the basis of our population projection and our growth plans. This is what all of the elements of the plan will get based on. So funding capital facilities, utilities, parks, everything based around the 2,100 units. We understand that the 2,100 units, and particularly the amount of affordable housing, is not likely a realistic estimation of growth to occur in the city, but nonetheless, this is the guidance we have received. Local housing needs and opportunities, although we cannot formally base our plan on the inflated number, we can use it to create capacity within our future land use map. So some of the analysis that we've done, which we're going to go through in a moment, can feed into capacity increases in the future land use map that could then potentially be activated through subsequent efforts. So for example, we've had a lot of public input from folks wanting to see more activity and development in the centers. They want more cultural events, places to go, different shopping opportunities, housing, those sorts of things. And I think one of the advantages of having to decouple somewhat the local housing needs from the growth target is that it does give us an opportunity to kind of phase in some of the changes that we're talking about. And this is a big upside. If we were having to make massive, changes to accommodate the growth target, without doing careful sub-area planning, that does create challenges. So this would allow us to say, do a sub-area plan for one of the centers, consider, density levels, infrastructure, affordable housing, uses, community engagement, and then feed that back into any changes to the comp plan and to potentially zoning and development regulations. So that is a significant upside of the guidance that we've received. So the first input is essentially the growth targets. These are broken down by income band. It's the 2,100 units. And this is the guidance from PSRC in terms of what our plan should be based on. For local housing needs and opportunities, we looked at kind of three main categories: housing affordability gap by income band. So this is looking at housing unit costs versus household incomes and matching up affordability. Looking at workforce housing needs by income band, so specifically those workers who commute into Sammamish, which is 80% of the work, or 86% of the workforce. And then the housing unit and household size mismatch. And I'll go through these in some of the next slides, but these were our inputs. And then we made some assumptions about how much we would want to accommodate for local needs. Okay, so now we'll go into some of the details on the local housing opportunities. So these are some of the findings, and these are reflected in the housing memo. Not surprisingly, there's a significant mismatch between unit size and household size in Sammamish. In particular, there's a large deficit in units of 2 or fewer bedrooms. That deficit, if taken in its full extent, is something like 6 or more thousand units. And on the next slide, I'll go through some of the limitations of this data and its findings. We've identified a potential disparate impact in the form of racial exclusion, and potential displacement is an ongoing concern. Within Sammamish, Klahani represents the highest displacement risk. Again, this is not identified as, say, a historically underserved community by any means, and I think there's more consideration that would have to be taken. But based on looking at the data, this does identify that area as the potential highest displacement risk, and there's some maps in there that highlight it. It's related to the degree of renters, housing vouchers, and race. The majority of cost burden households are making 100% plus AMI, indicating a deficit of market rate units, which gets at the issue of local need. There's limited housing affordability for lower income households. 15% of owner occupied units are affordable to households earning less than 100%, and 35% of rental units. So those are kind of the major findings that resulted in that analysis. So some of the limitations in this data, and I will just say that, again, having been practicing for over 20 years and doing a lot of work in housing and comprehensive planning, there's no real magic formula to be able to exactly answer this question around local needs. Part of that is because there is data that you could analyze, but there's also a local decision factor, right? Some folks living in a larger house that's larger than they need may want to downside. Others may have no interest in doing it, and it's difficult to predict those. So we've had to make some assumptions about how much we would want to try to accommodate in the future land use map. I'll go through those assumptions in a moment. Another limitation: workforce housing doesn't consider household income. So if we identify folks that are commuting into Sammamish that are maybe of lower income, based on the data, that doesn't account for the fact that their household income could be higher, and so it's difficult to assess the affordability level that we would need. Also, people make household choices based on a variety of factors. Maybe they have a partner that works in another city, and where they're living is convenient to both locations. Maybe they're really embedded in the community and don't want to leave, or their kids are in schools or whatnot. So again, there's a lot of personal choice that's difficult to assess within the data. But I think the data is also clear about what the trends are, and I think that's important to note. And then I would just say that there is some overlap between local housing needs and affordable housing allocations. So for example, in the 0 to 30%, our allocation from King County seems to far exceed what we've identified as a local need. And so in that case, we're certainly covering that with the allocation that we have. The needs analysis identifies, I think, what is a great opportunity to diversify Sammamish's housing stock and expand housing choices. I mean, the story, is fairly simple at that level, which is, 94%, I think, of the city is zoned single family. And, unsurprisingly, we don't have a lot of variety in units. The relative abundance of single family homes are expensive and, really don't address the affordability needs currently. This last bullet was a carryover from the last one. And I think, we would rephrase this to say that we can increase capacity, but we need to plan for the growth target in accordance with the guidance from PSRC. Okay, so this is just a summary of the local needs analysis. We do have a couple of the charts at the end of the presentation that we can refer to later if we need to. But this is looking at the household unit size and household size mismatch. So we're seeing a surplus of 2,000 3-bedroom and 4-bedroom units, 2,000, 3,000, and 200 respectively for those 3 categories. So that's a significant number of units. And again, it's difficult to understand how many of those folks would be interested in downsizing. But we have made some assumptions on that to provide significant opportunity for that. Workforce housing opportunity, we looked at numbers within AMI bands. Again, the data has some limitations. They aggregate the categories. So for example, like the retail worker category, the median wage was something like $100,000. So there are some limitations in the data. And again, we don't know household incomes, which is what housing affordability is based on. Internal affordability gap is pretty straightforward. It's just comparing incomes in Sammamish, household incomes with housing costs, typically rental costs. So we did look at ownership costs as well. And so this is independent of what people are actually paying for it. So it's basically looking at, do you have the housing and affordability levels to align with your household characteristics and median household incomes. There's another piece of data, and this is reflected in a King County dashboard that is more of a survey question that's asking people, what their incomes are and how much they're paying for housing. So it's a question around housing, affordability and whether people are cost burdened. The challenge with that data is it's quite outdated just because it predated COVID. So I think the median household income that they're using is about half of what it is now, for example. And there are some nuances to it such that it shows up as a fairly high number of 0 to 30% AMI homeowners being cost burdened, which again could indicate potentially high wealth, low income, but also being a homeowner. So again, I think just want to reiterate there's some nuances to the data that really require some interpretation to be really useful. So that's the numbers on internal affordability. And, again, I think there is some control over household incomes because there isn't a lot of access to affordable housing. So we didn't see a huge misalignment between incomes and housing. And certainly in the 0 to 50%, we're covered in our allocation, which exceeds what we found in our analysis. And then we also looked at accessible units and whether we might need some more accessible units, and we have determined that that would be another opportunity to expand units that are accessible. Okay, next section, we're going to now get into the growth target and the population projection. So just to kind of reiterate how we conducted the local needs analysis and how we got to the 5575. If you watched the city council meeting, we discussed this at length, but there was one kind of data piece that we had to update. So I think in the numbers that the Planning Commission got, this number was 5544 or something. There was one little update we made that increased it by 31 units. So it's not a significant change, but just want to show somewhat how we got the math. We also do have a subsequent spreadsheet that we've been working on that clearly shows the math path a little more explicitly that we're planning to share. But this is just kind of a highlight. So again, we took all of the 2,100 units of the affordable housing allocation. We looked at the internal affordability gap. We identified a need of 400, or we identified a gap of 444 units between 100 and 120%. The reason we didn't identify gaps below that is because we already are providing a high number of 0 to 50% AMI housing, which far exceeds what we came up with in our own internal analysis. So that's 444. And then, we started giving some thought to, well, what is a reasonable amount of opportunity to provide? Does this mean we can assume that all 444 people, need a more affordable place to live? And so that's what we should accommodate. That seemed like a little bit excessive. So we came up with, and these are inputs, these could easily be changed in the model that we're working on. But again, we wanted to provide reasonable opportunity, but not maybe overshoot what we thought might be realistic. So we came up with 50%. So we took 222 units and brought that over to the local needs category. For the workforce housing, we also decided to address 50% of it. These numbers reflect all of the workforce housing potential needs that we identified, again, based only on the worker incomes. And only 86% of these folks are commuting to Sammamish, 14% already live in Sammamish. So we counted for the 86% that live outside, and then we took 50% of those numbers and brought those over. In cases, again, where the affordable housing allocation exceeded what we found in local needs, we just use the number from King County. Okay. And then finally, the household size, unit size mismatch, we came up with, as I said earlier, about 5,800, just shy of 6,000 units. And again, it gets into the question, well, how many of these folks would, really be interested in downsizing? Difficult to estimate, but we thought given the high numbers of the deficit, if we provided 35% of the one bedrooms, that seemed like a reasonable number. So when we add up all these inputs, we get 3,475 plus the 2,100. That gives us the 5,575. Again, the meeting with the city council predated our discussions with PSRC. So at that time, there was discussion about whether we could base our land use assumptions and our planning on the 5,575, which PSRC has indicated we cannot. So in order to get the population projection, it's pretty easy. We just take the 2,100 units, we base it on the average household size that was used by King County and their assumptions, and we get the 5,775, close to the number we looked at before, but not related. And so that would be our increase in population that we would be planning for in our plan. And based on a linear projection, this is what it looks like, and we would get to an estimated population of just under 74,000 by the year 2044. We will have a 5-year check-in and report that we will need to be provided, and there are provisions in GMA for monitoring and adjusting. So one of the more well-known provisions is something called reasonable measures. So if you assume that development's going to happen at certain densities and intensities, and you don't find that to be the case, you are required to undergo reasonable measures to better align your assumptions with development patterns. So there is a process of sort of revision based on the monitoring program. Okay, so put that all together. These are, again, the affordable housing allocations and the collective growth target that we would be basing our plan on. We do have to provide 401 units of emergency housing, but that's sort of separated from the growth target and something that we're actively working on. And then finally over here are the income levels that are associated with those levels of housing affordability. Okay, so one of the things that I mentioned earlier is in order to provide the 2,100 units of housing, we need to provide certain types of housing units, right? So we can't provide the affordable housing units below 50% in single family housing. So we've been looking at the capacity in the places that allow mid-rise housing or that we're proposing to allow mid-rise housing. Right now, it's only the centers, including the town center. We've also been looking at bonus parcels, which are religious institutions and other publicly owned properties that could potentially provide affordable housing opportunities. And so based on our affordable housing allocation, 1,868 units must be in mid-rise housing, based on the guidance from the state. We have 232 units of between 50 and 80% AMI, and those can be provided either in mid-rise or in what's called a multiplex, which we'll go through when we get to the middle housing section. So based on our current assumptions for our land use plan to meet the targets, in the centers, we have a capacity of 960 units, and that is mid-rise housing. We would also have capacity within the bonus parcels, and these are very conservative assumptions. We've taken a number of properties we initially had in the bucket out of it and sort of, revised our assumptions downward to reduce approximately 1,180 units. So collectively, that's more than 2,100 units. So we can easily cover the 1868 within these two areas, and then the 232 units could be provided in a multiplex, which could include the areas subject to the middle housing changes, which we'll go through later, or could be in these locations within mid-rise. So this is just to show the math of how we're accommodating the growth target and the affordable housing allocation. Okay, so here's where we now are going to bring in the discussion of land capacity back here. So this chart shows kind of some of the terms that we defined early on in the presentation. So down here is our growth target, 2,100 units. This is our estimate of local need and opportunity. And again, this could be adjusted upwards or downwards based on the inputs that I just summarized. This is our collective proposed capacity based on our current land use assumptions for the proposed land use plan. So you can see that it well exceeds the growth target and the estimate of local opportunity. And then another thing that we wanted to mention is that there's additional capacity in the centers that can be activated through sub-area planning. So in the meeting with the city council, we had talked about increasing densities in the centers to allow for affordable and market rate units, and that would significantly increase the capacity for development. But because we're only able to base the plan on the growth target, we do have a little bit more time to make those changes and be a little bit more thoughtful about it. And so our idea is to set the stage for this in the future land use map. And then through the sub-area planning process and working with the community and the Planning Commission, really carefully think about what we would like to see happen in the centers, and really responding to a lot of the input that we received earlier in the process. So I think that is a benefit of the shift change from the input from PSRC. So for those of you that feel like the local needs and opportunities is not high enough, we're overshooting it by a lot. By a factor of 3,000 units under the current proposed capacity, and then through sub-area planning, potentially more than double that. So I do believe that we have some flexibility in it. The only real change is that our elements in our plan need to be based on the growth target. So we also have a jobs target, a relatively modest jobs target of 728 units. There is an opportunity to increase capacity, again, through the sub-area planning effort in the centers. We can sort of bank capacity within the flume and then assess that during the sub-area planning process. We can also add policy and guidance language for the sub-area plan development to provide some parameters. So this is something we do have enough capacity for within the centers and don't expect a big challenge in meeting our growth target. We're also working on the first economic development element for the city. And so there may be, other needs and goals for the city that we want to identify and consider. Okay. Next section is on middle housing. We have two questions that we're going to ask of the commission at the end of this section. The first is input on the 6 middle housing types that we're required to provide in single family areas in accordance with HB 1110. And then one of the decision points in HB 1110 is whether we plan for a minimum of 2 units or 4 units per lot. There is a threshold of 75,000 population where the 4-unit requirement kicks into place. And, from the chart I showed you on the population projection earlier, based on our current assumptions, we wouldn't achieve that until after 2044, but it's possible that the rate of growth is more aggressive than that, and we do achieve it sooner, in which we'd be required to comply with the 4-unit requirement. Okay, so just a quick summary of HB 1110. Cities must adopt an ordinance and incorporate, and this is direct language from the bill. Cities must adopt an ordinance and incorporate into its development regulations, zoning regulations, and other official controls to achieve compliance. So inherent in this is some update to the development code in order to activate this. We must provide a minimum of 2 units per lot on all residentially zoned lots. And that I think goes down to about 1,000 square feet. So even very small lots would be required to allow it. They would still have to comply with other development standards, of course, but the density would allow 2 units on every lot. We have to allow 4 units on all lots if at least 1 unit is affordable. Based on my experience, I think, for a market rate developer, the economics are not going to be there for a one-to-one bonus. So I wouldn't expect a lot of these units to be developed based on this provision, but it is something we must comply with. And then we must enable 6 of 9 middle housing types. And those include duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, fiveplexes, sixplexes, townhouses, stack flats, courtyard apartments, and cottage housings. So when we refer to a multiplex, that's generally like from a triplex to a sixplex. We can implement design standards. We can have design review, but it needs to be administrative as opposed to a design review board. There is an alternative compliance mechanism where rather than allowing these provisions in 100% of the single family areas, you can allow them in 75% of it. But we did do some analysis on critical areas which don't apply anyways, and it already exceeds the 25%. So our recommendation is to just move forward with all of the single family zones and, which already account for critical areas. There can be some changes in terms of how these housing types are allowed in different parts of the city. So you could have 6 housing types allowed in one part of the city and a different 6 in a different part if we wanted to do that, or we could keep it more similar. So these are a summary of the 9 housing types. Single family and ADU are not one of the 9, but we put it in here because it's kind of the baseline. So understanding that currently you can already develop 2 units with an ADU, but it is somewhat different than a duplex. So duplex come in a variety of forms, side by side, stacked, and there's a range of types here from older to newer. Triplex, 4 and 5plex, 6plex, and we have some models of these on lots that we're going to show in a few moments. Townhouse, college cluster, courtyard apartment, and stack flats. When we got input from the council, they seemed to indicate just picking kind of the first 6 seemed to make sense. It generally goes from less, intense to more intense. I would say cottage cluster is a little bit of an anomaly in that it is actually a single family typology. It can get fairly dense, but it may be one that we want to consider sort of out of that sequence. But again, they seem to indicate the first 6 made the most sense, but we appreciate the Planning Commission's input as well. Okay, a few other things that we want to consider, and this will, largely be addressed in the code, but we want to think about, site planning standards, having some prescriptive standards, but also providing some flexibility for things like natural drainage patterns, preservation of trees, solar access, parking configuration, those types of things. Massing and scale. We implemented a floor to area ratio system in development regs phase 2. That's something that we could potentially build on, so that we don't get buildings that are sort of overwhelming on their lots. How parking is designed and where it's placed. Are there alleys versus no alleys? This is an important distinction. How we integrate landscaping, stormwater, and address technical requirements like building and lot coverage. So we put together just some basic models of block development that shows kind of the range of those first suite of housing types. And we're showing that at densities of R12, which is 12 units an acre, and R18, which is 18 units an acre. These are pretty common middle housing densities. And in some cases are less dense than what you might find with 2 units on some of the smaller lots in Sammamish. So this is kind of diagrammatic, but this one is front loaded. So there are driveways with rear parking areas, does still allow some on-street parking. We've assumed for the purpose of developing these models, 1 parking stall per unit. That could get modified. And again, understanding there's quite a bit of street parking to provide some offset. You can see there's still opportunities to preserve or plant, significant trees. And as the building typologies get more intense, in some cases you get quite a bit more green space. So, there might be some opportunities to have some incentives for, maybe providing some public open space or something, in exchange for some relief on some of the lot sizes or, facilities for stormwater management, stuff like that. But you can see that, there is still opportunities for, common open space for the development, so on and so forth. So this is the cottage court, typically in the 12 units per acre is a pretty standard cottage court density. It's typically on a larger lot, shared open space, common parking areas. Townhouse development with shared parking, no garages. The sixplex, 4 to 5plex, the triplex, and then the duplex. So you can see the lot sizes adjust based on the number of units. Just a little bit closer look on the sixplex and fiveplex, just trying to show the relationship of the building size to the lot area for both of those, and the amount of on-street parking. There's looks like maybe 5 or 6 parking stalls along the frontage there. Same concept, but with alley-loaded access, which really creates a very nice streetscape and a nice environment for the pedestrian and bicyclist. It also opens up more opportunity for on-street parking. And there's some great examples of alley developments in Sammamish. So something we could think about in our updates to development regs, whether we want to incentivize that some more. And then same concept, but this is R18. So the building sizes stay the same. The lot sizes just shrink a little bit to get to the unit density of 18 units an acre. Again, same typologies. This is the front loaded option. A little bit less on-street parking in these options because the lot sizes and frontages are a little bit smaller, for what it's worth. And then the alley loaded option, again, with more on-street parking and rear access parking along the alley. Okay, that was a lot of talking. I'm going to pause there. We do have one other section and some more questions on the future land use map, and then we can go back and revisit any of the content from earlier in the presentation. So Commissioner Bresco, I'll turn it back over to you for these questions.
Okay, well, we'll give you a breather, Jeff.
Thank
That
you.
was a ton of information. Who'd like to start with any questions or comments? Ajay?
So I had one question that came up to my mind all the time when I was looking at this whole thing. Your projection, and first of all, fantastic presentation. Great work that has been done. So thank you so much for all that work. The question that I had was that your projection by 2044 was 74,000 from where we are right now to the population reaching up to 74,000. I don't remember the slide number. Yeah, there you go. That number came up to around 74,000. That is right under the 75,000 mark that we need if you have to change out the planning. Now, this also assumes that we will have the 2,100 plus 728 jobs. Now, let us say that we become successful in what we are doing, getting the 2,100 and getting the 728 jobs. Now, you don't even have to have the 700, about 500 jobs, right? That will have an almost immediate impact on this number going up beyond 75,000. How much of, what a margin of error does this account for when we are doing this thing? How close are we to breaking that 75,000 limit if we are successful in our planning by itself? Will our success end up causing this to go up beyond 75,000, which will get us back to thinking of 4 units instead of the 2 units? What kind of a, I was trying to figure out how to do that. And everything in that, when you start thinking of it, is like a negative test case, right? And you don't get the positive inputs for that. So I'm wondering, you had thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the simplest answer is we just took the 2,100 and applied the household size and did a linear projection. So, I mean, that's basically what we've been instructed to base the plan on. That aside, I think if left to our own devices, there's some other mechanisms that you could do to develop a population projection or a series of population projections that I think might be more realistic to what we would expect. I would say it's obviously difficult to predict, but I think there is a reasonable chance that we could outpace this. I think it's also pretty reasonable to assume that we're likely to see more market rate development than we are 0 to 50% AMI housing. And that's, based on professional experience, discussions with affordable housing providers, so on and so forth. So I think there's a reasonable chance that we would exceed the certainly the 73,925 before the 2044 number. So I'm not sure I completely answered your question, but I would say that there's a good chance that that things are going to play out quite different than what the assumption is here. And I think that's why we wanted to incorporate the local needs piece into our into the plan. And unfortunately, we've been instructed not to do that.
Got it. So that's where I was coming to, was to say that is the local needs becoming that buffer that we are
exactly. So the local housing could get built under zoning, but if we start to see that we're getting significantly faster rates of growth and it's all market housing, then we're going to have to come back and reassess things.
Got it. So it's up to us then to just plan out. I'm just throwing a number over here. Let's say 4 years from now or 3 years from now, to come back and look at it and say, hey, how far have we gone in this planning? Yeah. Are we looking at this kind of a, let's not call this the worst case estimate, but are we looking at this situation changing drastically, that we have to replan and all of those things? So the answer to this, I didn't expect a direct answer from you, but the answer to this could be that we have to have periodic verifications to say that we are getting there, we're not getting there, we are not going to be beyond 74,000. Let's not worry about it at this point in time, and so on and so forth. Am I right in that thought?
You're absolutely right. I mean, I would almost call it like mitigation and monitoring measures, right? It's like, you're absolutely right. We really need to frequently be looking at the growth trends data and being able to advance or see any issues in advance of having any compliance issues and opportunity to reassess that. So you're absolutely right.
Great. I said one question, but because you gave a great answer to the first question, I'll have a bonus question for you. The second thing was that you talked about Klahani as a neighborhood which was not diverse. So let's take a situation over here. As you were talking about it, I thought, let's say we get to the town center. We've done a good job at the town center. Everything is there. Everything is coming up. We planned everything well. There's walking and all of those things. Doesn't that skew against this Klahani? I mean, I'm not picking on Klahani, but I'm just asking you as an example. Doesn't that make it more difficult or a wider gap for Klahani to fill? Or should we do something else to try to bridge that gap? My worry then is that, as you were going through it, my worry was that, what if we spectacularly succeed in what we are doing with the town center? What if we get there? And wouldn't that make the worry that we have a much bigger problem to fix? Because everybody will then come towards the town center. It'll become a much more vibrant thing. There'll be more buses, there'll be more transit. A lot of things will happen around here, pushing Klahani even further back than where we thought we should be when it comes to that. Is that a risk that we should consider, or that is not a risk? You've seen this happen, and people generally kind of mill around and get to an area, and it's a problem that'll fix by itself.
When you refer to the issue with Klahani, what specifically are you referring to? Are you referring to the town center or some of the issues we identified in the housing?
To the issues that you identified in the housing.
Yeah, I really think they're not necessarily totally related. I do, except for the fact that I think if we can provide affordable housing opportunities anywhere in the city, then that's going to help that potential issue of displacement anywhere that it might occur. I think there's maybe a chance, of the town center and Inglewood or, Pine Lake, serving maybe more specific needs in the community. So I'm not sure we want to, duplicate the town center and all of those other centers. So I think there is some consideration around the role and function of each center, right? Like the neighborhood or the center in Klahani is quite different than Inglewood. It's sort of more of a neighborhood kind of thing. So I do think there's some opportunity to consider that, but I do kind of consider the affordable housing issue as more of a citywide thing. And anywhere we can provide it, we need to take those opportunities because, the big impediment is the cost of land, and if we can't overcome that, then we're really not going to see any production of affordable units.
Got it. Which means that we should look at it from that problem statement that you said, right? Which is to make it more making land affordability for housing a priority that we would work with, not look at specific areas and say that, is there going to be displacement and other things. Look at it from a city perspective.
Right.
Let's solve that as it is. If it turns out to the model that I was talking about, where it would differentiate at that point, we'll handle that at that differentiated point. But at this moment, the bigger problem is to get to this thing. Am I right in how you've translated it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think, if we're doing a sub-area plan in Klahani, we're going to talk with the people that live in Klahani extensively. And, they may want something different than the folks that live next to Pine Lake or whatever. So I think it's just an opportunity to go from the city scale to the neighborhood scale and really work a little bit more intimately with the property owners and residents that live in the area, as well, of course, with anyone in Sammamish that's interested in that process.
Great. You gave an easy out for me in that whole thought process. So this is great. Thank you so much. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
I guess it's my turn. Excellent presentation. It felt like I was in grad school or something. I'm okay with the 6 housing. I'll try to answer your first 2 questions and go on to other stuff. The 6 housing types that the council has already selected, or we discussed at a couple meetings ago.
Okay.
And then your second question about whether we should plan for less than or more than 75,000 population, kind of getting to Ajay's recent conversation. Given this whole issue between what we have to plan for the 2,100 units and future capacity, seems like staying on the low side right now might be wisest and safest, knowing that we can go through sub-area planning. We'll have a major update that we've got to do. I won't be around in 2034. So, not over planning what we don't know, I guess, is sort of what I'm thinking.
Okay.
That's my 2 cents on those 2 questions. In the main part of your presentation, and I kind of already knew this, we've talked about it a little bit, I'm really having difficulty reconciling, okay, we planned for the 2,100 units, which are mostly affordable units. But to get those affordable units, you need, in the marketplace, the other 90% have to be market rate to subsidize the 10% affordable,
Yeah.
or some percentage like that. So, yeah, we can plan for the 2,100 affordable units, but to get there using just pure market without any other subsidies, we're going to need a lot more market rate. Have I got that right?
You nailed it. Yeah. And we had what I think was a strong strategy to be able to address that. And, one of the biggest assets that the city has that it can leverage is that, the residential densities in the centers are relatively low.
Mm-hmm.
And, you can only create an inclusionary program if you're creating increased capacity in your zoning. If we had unlimited density, let's say, you have to comply with development standards and height and stuff, but there's no density limit, we would never be able to develop an inclusionary zoning program. So we actually wouldn't have that option. So you absolutely nailed it. And that was one of the things that we had put forth in the council meeting, was basically a way to provide a substantive increase in market rate units, such that it would support partnering with an affordable housing provider to develop the affordable units. Because inclusionary programs, in my experience, don't really work for the 0 to 50%. If you have a typical inclusionary program where it's a small percentage, like 5 or 10%, the math won't work. We won't get to the number of units. You know, if we are planning for the 2100, but we develop an inclusionary program such that you can't even develop the 2100 units without developing market rate units, but we can't factor the market rate units into our comprehensive plan and our capital facilities plan, that, you know, seems like a not a great direction to go. So I think our best strategy at this point is to really try to address those issues through the sub-area planning process.
Right.
In which case we can be really thoughtful about it. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Your comments were right on. And, you know, that's part of the, you know, somewhat frustration that we're experiencing with, you know, wanting to really comply, and not only just comply from a numbers standpoint, but actually see some of this stuff happen. It's challenging for us to see that at this point. So,
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Bosworth, you have comments?
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, echo the comments. This is all really great, and it's good to go through it a lot. You can stay here on this slide. So the existing zoned capacity that gets up to the 55, 75, that's okay to be there because we've already planned for the existing zone capacity? Is that a good way to think about it?
Actually, the way that I would describe it is that with compliance for HB 1110, we're required to inevitably significantly increase the capacity. So this number here, the 8392, reflects our relatively conservative analysis of the capacity that would be created through HB 1110. So that's where we get above. The existing capacity of the city is somewhere around, I think in the urban growth capacity study, it was somewhere around 2,000. And then there's some additional units that could happen in the town center through incentives that weren't accounted for, but could theoretically happen. So that's how we get there. And hopefully that answered your question. Yeah.
I mean, if we have existing zone capacity, have we already planned for it?
We have not planned, well, when you say the term plan for, I would associate that with like basing your entire comprehensive plan on it. No, we have not done that. HB 1110, again, requires you to make big changes to your plan and regulations, but it doesn't change it doesn't change your growth target, I guess is my point.
And how do we plan for it? How do we make sure that we have?
We would, yeah, go in and change the development regulations and potentially the zoning to comply with HB 1110, which would increase our capacity to this number here. And then we have additional potential capacity through sub-area planning to get us up to above 12,000 potential units in capacity.
Well, I'm definitely glad to see that we can go, that flexibility is in there. And going back to, you know, we don't have the greatest track record on affordable housing. So we've, you know, earlier we said that we know we have some need in the lower affordability, but that it's covered by the growth target, or the affordability units, but if those don't come for a while, then we're not actually addressing needs. So that's just I understand the math, but at the same time, we're not also solving the problem in any immediate time frame. The sub-area planning does seem to be a great place for that, and I would definitely want us to, I could see how we could incentivize that, and that would be a good and desirable place for that to go. And I like that we could take our time with that. It's just that may not happen for quite some time.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree with you. But I still think there is opportunities to, you know, through future implementation efforts, put in additional measures that can help achieve the outcomes, you know, that are essentially mandated and I think also desired in the community.
And Jeff, if I can add, you know, This is a new environment that we're planning under. This is not like 2015 where it was a really simple math exercise. On one point, we're being told by PSRC you need to plan for your growth target, 2,100, which also happens to be our affordable housing allocation. And then we have through our urban growth capacity study, our capacity, which is 3158. But we know with House Bill 1110, our capacity is a lot greater. And so there's just these two buckets, what we're planning for and what our capacity is. And it is a challenge and it is evolving. So I swear every couple of weeks we're getting new information, we're getting new guidance, and which is why we're coming back to you with some information that's just a little different than what was presented to City Council. That's how fast this is evolving. So I'm pretty sure next time we come back to you, we'll be able to refine that down a little bit more. But this has definitely been a challenging planning year for not just the city of Sammamish, for all cities planning under the GMA, and making sure that, one, we can produce a comprehensive plan that will get certified by PSRC. So we take their word very seriously, but also that we're not creating any barriers or any challenges within any updates we have to make in regards to 1110. 1110 came after we received our growth target, so it's just a bonus we're working with. So I guess really in summary, when we're looking at the comprehensive plan, we are looking to plan for 2,100. There is a chance that within 10 years, we are probably going to meet that number through a development, and it probably will happen before 10 years. We'll have to reopen our comp plan and do some revisions. So there is a trigger. There is, as Jeff mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, there is a considerable amount of monitoring that will happen. So we won't get to 1,999 units and be like, oh, everyone, we got to work on our comp plan. We'll be able to monitor that and strategize on when a good time to do it is. But to get our affordable units, we're definitely going to need to look at inclusionary zoning, sub-area planning, development agreements, and that potentially can take us closer to that number. And at that time, we'll have to look at updating our comp plan, but a lot to come. So I'm hoping that helps clarify some things.
Yeah, and for me, it's not critique. It's just trying to wrap my head around things as well. Like, for example, in Town Center, some projects are moving forward and they're not going to be part of the 2,100. So we are going to be building.
Right.
And like, is PSRC okay with that if 800 starts growing here and maybe the 2,100 do take off somehow? Like, is that okay? And are we able to internally figure out and plan for that in terms of facilities and stuff like that?
Right. And I think some of it even is outside of our control, right? It's controlled by the market. So what we need to demonstrate is we have the 2,100. We can show where we can meet our affordable allocations. And then, as a city, we have to do our due diligence to see if we can make that happen. And that's through some of the strategies you all recommended as part of the Housing Diversification Toolkit. But I think it's gonna be an interesting conversation with PSRC, not just from us, but from most cities, that, hey, to meet our allocation of affordable housing, we did need to incentivize it, and we did so, which means we're on track to 2,100 faster than we anticipated. And I think it's gonna be a common theme, and I know they're aware of it. But yeah, again, we're working under new rules that haven't been beta tested with previous plans, and this is what our plan will be, as well as everyone else's in the region. So,
got it. All right, thank you. I did want to go back to Kalahani just because I don't understand. I understand the words, I've looked up the meaning, but is the net of it that Kalahani is too white? Is that the I don't understand. I don't understand the graphic or the problem there.
Okay, yeah.
And since it's pointed out, I just want to understand it a little bit more.
Yeah, can I switch my screen here for a second? I will, hold on a second. Okay, you should see the housing report now. I'm going to zoom in if I can see it. So I want to qualify, this with, again, this is looking at kind of high level sets of data, and this is these are another set of new requirements for comp plan updates to look at potential impacts of exclusion or displacement. And let me go to the right slide here. Yeah. Okay, so first, we looked at income brackets by race, which is a requirement, and we identified some populations of concern in this under 25,000 AMI category. So that's one piece of it. We also compared King County to Sammamish, and you'll see that the county is more diverse than Sammamish is. So that's, I think, another indicator that we looked at. And then going down to this map here. So this is looking at percent of owner occupied housing units. So lower rates of owner occupancy or higher rates of renter occupancy generally indicate potential higher rates of displacement depending on other factors. And then looking at population by race percentages. And so this area had a lower white population and also had a low number of, or a higher number of renters, which was also another indicator. And then we looked at housing vouchers, and there was higher rates of housing vouchers, 18 and 19 in there. And then we also looked at percent of cost burdened households, which is the data I referred to earlier, which is survey data about actual costs. And that resulted in 42%. So again, I would say the data has given us some indication that relative to other parts of the city, this is where the highest potential displacement risk would be. And so it's something we want to document and acknowledge and think about as we develop policies and programs, understanding that the city has some relatively limited tools, but there are other organizations out there that have housing programs related to affordability and preventing displacement. And so having this information available and documented is an important part of the process. So that's kind of the extent of it.
And what would help the situation? Is it too expensive there?
Yeah, I mean, let's say that you're a low income cost burdened household that's renting. If there was, say, one of those 0 to 30% AMI units that someone could move into, stay in the community, not be cost burdened, I mean, that would be a potential option. The other thing is, just trying to prevent displacement as well. And I think that's something we can look at from a policy perspective, but again, recognizing that the city, at least most cities, have sort of limited tools with which to work with, but it is something that we need to consider as part of the plan.
Okay, so they could be priced out from a rental perspective is what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks. I was just trying to understand.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. There's a lot of data and a lot of nuance to it. So appreciate the question.
Okay, and I had one final question about the land use, the slide with the arrows going over to the.
Yeah, sure.
I think I finally figured out the math by it didn't add up.
Yeah.
For me, so I think it was 2B.
Yeah, 2B doesn't add up because this one is the hardest one. Yeah. This one is easy. We just took 202.
I got that far, but I think I got it. Like, so you add those up, take 86% of it, and then divide it by half.
Exactly, except the only nuance is that in categories where our target is higher, we didn't port it over, right? So this says 498, but we're already providing, we only brought over the balance of units, I guess. So if the lower affordability was already accounted for in the growth target, we didn't port it over. So that's the only nuance, but otherwise your math what you described is perfectly right.
And then does
then for
2C,
this one-
2C
Yeah.
comes over too?
Yeah, just
Okay.
35% of this number comes over.
Okay, thank you.
And that went into the 120% plus AMI category. And again, I have a spreadsheet that literally shows all of the math. So once we finish that, we'll share it out, and that'll have all the math paths, so to speak.
Yeah, and to answer just the 75,000 question, I did note that council was pretty much split, and I guess based on, what we're talking about here tonight, I guess tackling that later, which could be sooner, seems like the right thing to do.
Can we coach you on that?
Yeah. So that would be my input for that, and then the first 6 look good to me too. So thank you.
Great, thank you.
All right.
Jeff, thank you very much for the very informative and detailed presentation. I have some of my comments related to some numbers. For instance, the population projection, is that land use based, employment based, target based, King County based, PSRC based? Which one?
Target based.
Target based.
It's just 2,100 times 2.75, which is the average, I think, household size in King County that they used for the urban growth capacity study that they do in advance of setting the targets. So that's where it comes from.
Do you know, or maybe staff know, when the Klahani was annexed to the city? Do you know the year?
I don't, I believe.
Yeah, I think it was 2016. It was shortly after the 2015 comp
The
plan was
reason that I
adopted.
asked that question, it looks like that based, Jeff, on you have some graphic to show that population in 2016, city's population was 49,000, and in 6 years it jumped from 49 to 68,000. Now we're saying that, yeah, right there. We're saying that between now and last year, 2022, 68, we're only increasing it by 7,000. Do I read it right? In 20 years?
Yeah.
How could it be possible?
Well, I mean, I share your concern. Again, this was not something that we came up with. It's just what was provided to us through the King County, process.
So this is
completely share your concern.
So this is consistent with the PSRC projected population for the region?
Well, it
Gaining
starts with the
7,000
state.
in 20 years?
Yep. Well, there's a couple things that happened. The state does their projection, then it goes to the counties, but the city of Sammamish also went down a category in cities to the cities and towns categories, which generally take on less growth. So there was a whole process that resulted in the 2,100, unit growth target.
The other question, you just mentioned that the existing capacity is 2,000 and proposed capacity is 8,392. Did I write it down correctly?
You did.
That is a huge jump.
Actually, existing capacity through the urban growth capacity study was 3,158. Yeah, and our growth target is 2,100.
So from 31 to 83, that is a jump of 5,000?
Yeah, that is also accounting for House Bill 1110. So
Right.
Wow.
that is where that big jump in capacity is. And that is mandated by the state.
The report makes reference to Exhibit 1, and I could not find Exhibit 1 in the staff report. I don't know, maybe. Anyway, that's minor. What is FLUM in the report?
Future land use map. It's kind of the basis for the whole comprehensive plan, and it sets the stage for your zoning map, but it's basically a conceptual representation of ideal, what the community would like to see in terms of land uses and other, features. So it's an important part of the process.
You also mentioned that there is a misalignment between the
Yeah, I would say Sammamish stands out as, I mean, I think any city that's predominantly single family is probably gonna have similar results, but I think, Sammamish probably stands out because there appears to be a lot of fairly large houses and it's predominantly single family. So I don't have specific numbers on comparisons, but I think, Sammamish is probably on the high end of that mismatch. But with that said, also has a fairly large median household size compared to other communities. I think it's over 3 in Sammamish. So there are some larger households that, take advantage of those larger units. And I think there's some that, are living in larger units than they maybe need or even desire.
We have talked a little bit about a lot tonight, actually, about the lot. What is different? What is the lot size? Is that 4,000 a square foot or 20,000 a square foot?
Sammamish does not have a minimum lot size in their existing single-family zones. This is something that we addressed in Development Regs Phase 2. So under the previous predating Development Regs Phase 2, projects could set aside open space or common open space and reduce the lot size to whatever they thought made sense and could comply with the other development regulations. Now there is a floor to area ratio limit. So your lot size gets bigger as your home gets bigger. So there's some flexibility in that, but there are criteria for the open space set aside. It can't just be a random plot of land. It has to meet some criteria and provide some benefits. But beyond that, there right now is not a minimum lot size. Under some of the models that I showed for middle housing, the lot size would be scalable to the number of units and types of housing. So,
but
as you have more units, the housing
is it fair? Is it right? A lot size of, let's say, 5,000 a square foot, we can possibly allow 2 units to be developed in that versus 10,000. So, is it? I don't know. It doesn't seem all right.
Yeah. So that's where the bill. You're right on target with that comment. That is a notable, I would say, absent piece of the legislation is that it doesn't define a density for future lots. But it does require us to provide 6 of 9 middle housing types, and there's some kind of standard typical densities, which is the R12 and the R18 are 2 of them that I showed you earlier. That generally accommodate those range of housing types. So that's one of the things that we need to figure out is what do we want the lot sizes to be for these types of housing? And I think inherent in the bill is that we develop something that works and is feasible, but also, fits in with Sammamish and, contributes positively to the community. So we want to be really thoughtful about that. And that's going to be an important part of this process.
Targeted number of employment, targeted number of job was 728. That's what I noted. Is that based on that target number of units, 2,100?
That also comes from the same process, relatively speaking, as the housing target. So goes to the county and then is filters down to the city. So some cities. In areas where there's some parts of the state where cities don't get employment targets, and they'll do estimates of, say, whatever the ratio of housing and jobs is now to kind of plan for that in the future. But in our case, we just got the target from the county.
Can you comment on the PUD as a way of resolving some of these issues that we talked about?
Yeah. So as part of development regulations phase 2, we looked at planned unit developments, or PUD, or planned residential developments, which is residentially focused. We had actually gotten pretty far into drafting regulations for that, but the Planning Commission, I think rightfully so, felt like they wanted some more time to consider it. So it's a topic we may pick up again. Planned unit developments, I think, have some benefits. They provide some more flexibility in exchange for, better design and better public benefits. So that is one approach. I would say maybe more common is just, being more specific about what the community would like to see as part of a development, rather than just, providing flexibility. So there's pros and cons of each approach, but I absolutely think planned unit developments can be a good tool to get more diverse housing and get more diverse housing in one project, as opposed to just individual projects of the same housing type. Like you could require, 30% of the units be this type or whatever. So I think, there is definitely some advantages of it, and I think something we absolutely want to consider.
Would you consider Klahani as a large-scale PUD?
Yeah, I would.
As you know, Jeff, we have had a lot of discussions, and finally, I think that the City Council adopted Housing Action Plan, and you didn't mention anything about that. How would you integrate the Housing Action Plan in the analysis that you do?
Yeah, so we've been tangentially involved in the housing diversification toolkit development. We attended one of the meetings where the council was discussing it. We've looked over the reports, in detail. So we're trying to be consistent with it. We also, I think, wanted to do some additional analysis on local needs. That we thought was important. So I think we're trying to be consistent with it, but also build upon where that effort kind of left off as we continue to work on the comp plan.
As far as the housing type, you showed us two different concepts. One is a front loading. I'm specifically talking about the parking, front loading and a back loading, so to speak, alleyway. I just want to mention that the reason that the Issaquah Highland is so popular, and over the years everybody wanted to kind of go and buy property there, is if you look at their housing, almost all of their housing are actually alleyway parking, and that's why so everybody likes it rather than traditional parking in front with a huge garage and driveway. And also when you do, as you probably know, when you're talking about a small lot, by the time that you take the part of the curb because of the driveway to the garage, the remaining curb space is going to be very much limited. So you're going to have a very few number of parking spaces that you can account for to serve the community, to serve the units. So I'm all in favor of the alleyway parking right in the front. Thank you very much.
Great description of the benefits of the alleys. Thanks. Appreciate all the questions.
Would you like to comment on the two specific questions about the middle housing type and the 2 versus 4?
I personally like the one that I support the council's position. I think that makes sense.
Thank you.
Okay.
Would that be, can I follow up? Would that be in conflict of as far as the parking, those concepts? With the alleyway parking? No, it would not affect that.
Yeah.
No, then I'm all for it.
I think all of those
they can
units
all
could
work with
support
those.
alley loaded. We'd have to take a look at that through design standards and through the development regulations a little bit closer and evaluate that. But looking at this graphic, I think that is definitely achievable.
Okay. Well, I have a couple of questions before answering the 2 questions that we have. So I appreciate this graphic. The middle housing also include, I think it was stack flat was one of the versions, one of the 9 types, stack flat, yes. Could you comment a little bit, just define the difference between a 6-plex, a townhouse, and the stacked flats? What are the key differences among those?
Yeah,
You're smiling.
Well, the simple answer is, in a lot of ways, these things are pretty interchangeable and they're very similar. So it's a really good question. So, I think the plexes are just simply the numbers of units within there. That's pretty easy. Townhouse is generally side-by-side attached units. Townhouse, row house is kind of a similar, name for it. But it can include, more than 3 units or whatever. There's not necessarily a set number there for those. The cottage cluster, which you didn't ask me about, but that's single family. Courtyard apartments, obvious. The stacked flats, I think, is anything above 6 units would be considered a stacked flat. So this one appears to have 8 units in it. But, Yeah, so it's just really the number of
Yeah,
units.
part of
that's
my
in there.
question was about the affordability and the capacity. So
Yeah.
would the typical townhouse cluster, if you will, have more or less units than, say, a sixplex? Or it depends. I don't, so-
Yeah, it really depends. It could
Okay.
be less, it could be more. I can say from some of my past experience, some of these are going to be more economically feasible than not. And typically what we find is that the larger townhouse units are the most feasible in the for sale version of those. So for what it's worth, those tend to be the most feasible. I think, some of the smaller multiplexes are probably the most potential for affordable units because they're smaller and, more compact building style. But the townhouses could have any number of units in them.
Okay,
And-
that's helpful. So, yeah, the courtyard apartments are like, ugh, and probably the stack flats. So I think I am agreeing with what the council said. But I also want to
Yeah.
mention, I think it's important, the cottage cluster, and maybe I'm, jaundiced a little bit or biased in my opinion because a number of the people that are within my network are empty nesters. And the cottage style would be much more preferable to a sixplex or fourplex. It feels more like a home. So if I'm downsizing or they're downsizing, it would be good to offer those kind of cottage clusters. So for the second question, I think in the spirit of what the Puget Sound Regional Council is suggesting, which is not to overplan, and using the numbers that they're saying, which would get us below the 75,000, I would say to go with the 2 rather than the 4. It seems like they're leading us in that direction. So why try to stack more in? And one of the other reasons I'm thinking about that is, I know we're playing around with the potential for growth, and Jeff, I understand the calculations, and they make sense given the givens. But I also saw some charts that talked about basically the number of households that would become empty nesters. And so I think it's likely that we may grow above the 75,000, but it's not a given. And it could be just as likely that the growth will kind of flatten out in terms of the population because of the aging of the population. So I'm comfortable assuming that we're going to be below 75,000. So those are those questions. And then I just want to have one, because we've all asked a few clarifying questions from earlier in the presentation. And that is about the number of units that are potential with the passage of that House bill. It seems high given the number of areas that are protected either because of HOA or environmental considerations. Can you just summarize briefly how the capacity goes up so much with House Bill 1110?
Yeah, so I do agree with you. It is a relatively small, part of the city, and just to be clear about how we've done this analysis, and I actually do think the number is actually conservative, but we get from King County their urban growth capacity study data, and that identifies the parcels that are vacant or likely to redevelop. Typically because there's low improvements to land values, which is an indicator. So that's an amount of land that's likely to redevelop. And then through that process, we, excuse me. Through that process, we then identify the parcels that are within single-family zones. So per HB 1110, we're required to allow middle housing in all single-family zones. So that includes everything from R1 on up into all of the single-family zones. And then, basically at that point, we then apply an assumed middle housing density, right? So based on those lot and block models that we showed earlier, and also thinking about, what would the density be if you allowed 2 units on a small lot in Sammamish, which we're going to be required to do. We then just apply those density assumptions and we get the capacity increase. And so, for example, if you're going from an R1 district, which is 1 unit per acre, to a middle housing density, those numbers can escalate fairly quickly. But I can say that, the rate of growth that we would see in middle housing would be, much, much, much less than the capacity that we would create. And it would be, dispersed amongst those parcels that were identified by the county as being redevelopable. So that's how it works. And, it doesn't take a lot of land to really exponentially increase those numbers.
The difference between single family and middle housing, I guess, right, is the main thing. So,
yeah.
Okay, I understand you have additional presentation, part 2.
Well, it's sort of, the last part. It's not
the last part. Okay.
So hopefully this will be a little bit of a lighter discussion. And a little bit more maybe fun to think about. Not that the numbers aren't fun, but one of the things that is a big goal of this process is to create a more useful future land use map. And what is very common in probably most of the cities that we work with is that you have a future land use map which gets adopted in your plan, and then you have a zoning map, and they need to be relatively consistent, but they don't need to be the same map. And I think most cities, again, have a zoning map and a future land use map that are like the exact same thing. And so the land use map and the plan becomes really not that effective of a tool. The other thing is that anytime you make any change to your zoning, you then have to go back and make a change to your plan. And you're limited to only one update per year, unless you're doing something unique like a sub-area plan or something else. So I think that's kind of our overall goal. And so this concept that we've developed, starts to move in that direction. And I think will be more of a useful planning tool. And essentially what the future land use map is, if you had the city plan of what you would like to see in 2044 on one map, so it's really, really, really foundational. So we have a couple questions we can go through at the end, but just want to run through the examples now. So one of the things that we're looking to do is create new future land use map categories. And these will be somewhat distinct from zoning. And one of the things that we'll do in the plan is we'll identify these future land use categories, identify a range of zoning districts acceptable in that area, right? So you could theoretically in the future change the zoning from one of those categories to the other, as long as it doesn't require a change to the future land use map, you wouldn't have to amend your plan. So it gives you some more flexibility. We can also identify things like, mixed use centers and have policies and strategies around those for things like sub-area planning and so on and so forth, but we don't necessarily have to make all the zoning changes before we figure that out. So it becomes more of a flexible tool for the city to use. So these are some of the categories that we've come up with. We're certainly interested in your input on this. But on the commercial side, we have 3 categories. We have the town center. We have the mixed use centers, which are the 3 town centers that are currently outside of the town center. And then we have neighborhood center, which is a smaller category. We only have one of those designated now on East Lake Sammamish Parkway. And then we've identified conceptually on the map I'll show you in a moment, some potential locations for it. And those locations aren't necessarily fixed, but they identify, hey, the community would like to see some more neighborhood centers. These are some potential locations. And then there could be a variety of ways that they actually get implemented. So it's a really good tool in that sense. So these are kind of the basic categories that we came up with, and we're certainly open to input. So the first thing that we did is we took the sort of the existing future land use map and we recreated it, but just using the new categories. So it's more of a comparison to what we have today. And in some cases, it's hard to decouple the future land use map from your thinking about zoning, because people, I think, are more tuned to thinking about zoning. And one of the things that you can do in your future land use map is identify like priority open space corridors or buffers. And, you know, if you identify those, it doesn't mean that you can just put in your zoning that no one can develop it, right? Because that would be illegal. But what it does do is it identifies as a priority. So maybe the city in partnership with a land trust or something, you know, goes out and acquires it. But the zoning may still allow for development to happen. So again, it starts to identify community priorities that might also be implemented in other ways through non-regulatory means like property acquisition. So I think that's, a good example of how it becomes more of a flexible tool. So these are those same categories. So again, most of the city is the single family, currently single family, which we're proposing to change to neighborhood residential. This is the area where we have to implement HB 1110, what we just talked about. Urban residential would be a little bit more dense, and maybe it allows some other middle housing types that we aren't required to provide in HB 1110. So this would be a local decision. But if, for say, we wanted to have, you know, more dense development around our centers, as you see here in Inglewood, we could do that through the urban residential designation. And then there'd be, you know, maybe 2 or 3 districts that would go with that. The town center is obvious. The mixed use centers are the 3 outside of the town center. And then our one neighborhood center right now is down here. And this is the only spot that does have a neighborhood kind of commercial zoning district within the city. And then we've identified existing parks and open spaces and forested lands. So again, if we identify a forested land that we may have a policy to say we would like to protect those, we can't protect it through zoning, but we still want to identify it as a priority. And if we just match our zoning map, we're not really able to do that. So it gets a little bit lost in translation. So the next concept here is our future flume. And this includes the land use categories that I just previously described. It can also include overlays. And those overlays, again, don't necessarily mean that they're going to prohibit development, but it's identifying, you know, things that have significant planning implications. And one of those is the wildlands urban interface, which is here in this hatching area. And again, we still would zone this area, for example, that's shown over the yellow as, you know, one of the zones that go with the neighborhood residential, but it's important to identify it. We've identified stream corridors, which are important features, obviously, in Sammamish. We've also identified what's called wildlife bridges. These are wildlife sort of migration patterns or travel patterns. These were identified in a King County map that we brought in and have identified. Again, doesn't necessarily mean there's a specific zoning strategy around that. There could be, but again, it identifies important features in the city that we want to think about from a land use perspective. We've also identified wetlands and bogs. We will, of course, include in the land use section a full critical areas map or series of critical areas maps. We specifically didn't add them all in here because the map would be too busy and illegible. One thing we've also identified here in the future land use map, and something that we would look at through sub-area planning, is, you know, do we want to think of Inglewood and the town center kind of as one thing? I mean, they're adjacent to each other. There's a lot of activity in Inglewood. It's already developed. It does have capacity for infill and redevelopment. You know, and there's different ways that you could do it. You could designate it all as town center. You could have this as a transition zone and keep them somewhat distinct. But again, it's something that sets the stage for some more thinking in the community through the future land use map, regardless of what the zoning, you know, solution might be. And then finally, again, we've identified just conceptually where some neighborhood centers could go, right? And you know, it was brought up the concept of planned unit developments. You know, maybe there's a process that's spelled out in the code and in the plan. If a planned unit development's done, they could include a proposed neighborhood center, and that would give them some flexibility on zoning and would provide broader benefits to the broader neighborhood than just the development. So again, there's more thinking to do, but as a conceptual level, it really starts to take shape for what we'd like to see in the city. Like, for example, this one is potential because there's property there. It's also really close to Redmond and the light rail. You know, some of these other areas are pretty far from the neighborhood, the existing center. So maybe that would indicate a good location for those. And again, these can be updated over time and provide us some flexibility. So back to the 2 questions. First one, what does the commission see as the role of the future land use map? Do you support, what I just described and kind of making it more of a flexible tool? And then do you have any input or thoughts on the categories, the content, any suggestions where we would love to hear it. So Commissioner Bresco, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you. Well, the second part was much shorter than the first part, so I think we thank you for that. Said, would you like to start this time? And we'll work
I was
this way?
thinking about, I would be in favor of two different maps, one residential, and then would it be possible, Jeff, to kind of show one map of the residential, but then break it down in a different density zone? For instance, shows this area that potentially could be developed at R2, R3, whatever. Kind of zoom in a residential, but show the different size, because this one tells me that the majority of the area, which is absolutely right, is residential, but doesn't tell me that much about where the high density, low density areas is. Is that something that would be possible, would be useful to the staff and the community?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that we talked about today with the city staff is we'll then need to take these, general categories, give them definitions, better define them, give like a range of densities and zoning districts that go with it in terms of how these things get implemented. And then I would say from there, we do need to have an overall map, but we could do, inset maps in specific areas that provide a lot more detail. We could add, and at that scale, you could show things like parcel boundaries and things like that. We do also have this all digitized in GIS. So we do have the ability to make an online map pretty easily, which allows for navigation, zooming in, perhaps clicking on features and getting information. So that's an option. And then there are some other kind of visual communication tools that we can consider. We've also been talking about creating an online, web-based version of the plan, which would allow for some more interactive elements that could deal with some of the scale issues of showing a citywide map in a printed plan.
Would it be useful to kind of show maybe a 3D concepts that shows the height that kind of visually you can see, like architecture model that you can see for the buildings? Is that feasible?
Yeah, I think it is. I don't know as I would do it at the city scale. What I might do is like some little vignettes or diagrams that could match up with each of the categories, land use categories and zoning categories that would show the relative scale or height, maybe more at the site or at the block scale. So I definitely think we could do that. I just, it would be a little challenging to do it at the city scale, but we can definitely include some of that.
On a non-residential, I see your category. First of all, what is BOG, B-O-G? What is
It's
that?
like a wetland bog, like a...
What is the difference
A
between
bog is a
wetland and
type of
bog?
wetland, I think, with more like standing water. So it's a type of wetland.
So yeah, if that is the case, because I was going to say that if you want to have a separate map showing the wetland, because I understand that between the
Yeah.
park and open space and a wetland, we have substantial amount of undevelopable land.
Yeah, I mean, the wildlands urban interface isn't undevelopable. Certainly the wetlands are, although there are some nuances to that for things like, having reasonable use of property, but largely restricted from development. The wildland urban interface is a little bit different. It identifies sort of the somewhat of the wildfire, risk, and is something we want to consider out in that respect, but not necessarily limiting development.
I know that I'm asking a different question on this, but from staff point of view, how many sub areas do we have in the city?
Just one, the town center.
That's it?
Mhm.
So you don't have sub areas for residential neighborhoods and things like that?
Well, are you talking about like, there's different zoning districts, but we have one sub area that has been planned for, that's the town center. And then we have outside of the town center, we have a variety of different zoning, residential zoning, commercial, neighborhood, business.
No, for instance, Inglewood is a community, right?
Yeah, that is not
Could
in the
that be a sub area?
No.
Do you have any intention to create those? Does it make a sense to do it?
I think we have had that conversation on neighborhood centers to that extent, but we haven't gone beyond just looking at our neighborhood and our mixed-use centers. We haven't looked at other sub-areas that could be a potential.
Because I see that different neighborhoods in the city, they have different characteristics, design characteristics, population, socioeconomics,
Yeah,
and so forth. So it would make sense to kind of divide the city.
absolutely. And you're seeing that in Redmond right now. That's exactly what they've been doing, creating neighborhood districts that, yeah, kind of split the city into almost like a puzzle with each piece being its own sub-area. I'm not sure if we're there yet as far as part of this comp plan, but that's a question that we would.
Have you got any
to
discussion with the city council? Is there a city council that have any position on this?
Jeff, I have not heard anything beyond what we've presented to them. Do you recall if there's been any feedback from council on this?
Well, there certainly is interest. There certainly is interest in the centers. Again, when we presented this to council a few weeks ago, it was based on a little bit of a different set of assumptions. But, I think we could set up, future sub-area planning, and then if we do a sub-area plan for, say, one of the centers, then that would be formally designated, and those become part of the comprehensive plan. So I think there's opportunities to do, sub-area planning, but Kelly's right. As of right now, the city only has one designated sub-area. That's been the result of a sub-area plan, which is a formal type of plan that's referenced in GNA.
And when you look at this map, Jeff, it looks like that you foreseeing that there is a continuity of the town center to go all the way to the Inglewood. Basically, that area will be a retail corridor. Is that right?
I think it's something worth thinking about. Having two distinct plans and not kind of thinking about those holistically, whether Inglewood becomes part of the town center or formally or not, I think there's a way to think about at least the hatched area and how those two pieces integrate, but also the range of uses and so on and so forth. So I absolutely think it's worth considering.
So again, back to the main question, my personal opinion is that if you have layers of different residential, one residential map with showing different densities and so forth, and one, you can do one for commercial retail, we don't have any industry in here, and so forth, that would be really useful.
Yeah, we will do that, and we can add some photo examples and, like I said, some diagrams and things. There'll be, a narrative portion of the plan that will have summaries of each of these categories and more information. So,
also by having different kind of maps, when you go to the public, when we have open house, people understand and give you more constructive comments when we give them that kind of information, right? And a general map with a bunch of colors.
Understood. Agreed.
Thank you.
We probably should look at extending the meeting time. So motion for that, somebody?
Make a motion to extend to 8:40? 8:45?
8:45. So
I'll
motion,
second it.
okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. So
So I think you said during your so I really like this map a lot. I think you said during the presentation you didn't put critical areas because it would get too busy. But and as well as I know Mary, I think I was always wanting hazards as well overlaid on things. But I think it might be okay because this map is really showing, I don't know if there's any critical or hazard right where it's showing activity on this map, so I guess that's okay as far as I'm aware. What's kind of exciting about this is everything I've read to date, in previous packets and stuff, is that we don't have a lot of developable land and we don't have a lot of capacity, and so this really kind of opens it up, not automatically, but allows people to really look at it in a more creative, constructive way, such that this is where, I see this as being part of a PSRC liking this, being like, okay, you're showing me possibilities such that developers or whomever or homeowners could look at this and be like, okay, I can see where I can participate and develop or help, our certain goals. So is that this kind of it feels like it almost expands the possibilities. Is that a good way to look at it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And I think provide some more flexibility because zoning is very matter of fact, right? Like you don't implement something in zoning unless you really know what you're doing, right? And that's a hard thing to be like, well, I'm just going to develop a neighborhood center zoning and put it in place and see what happens. I mean, that's a strategy, but not one that I've seen really work that well. So this, again, is a good communication tool to talk with the community about. And, you know, someone could come and say, well, geez, I live over here. I'd love to have a neighborhood center. And, you know, it would be great if, you know, we did this, or I really don't like that. We should change that. It's more of a conversation piece and more real than just like, you know, what we could change the zoning to. So that's absolutely the intent as you described it, for people to kind of understand more conceptually and be able to participate in the process and express, you know, what they would like to see in the future of the city, even if we haven't, you know, ironed out every detail.
Got it. And so like a mixed use center, you know, whoever owns that, or, you know, collectively or whatever, they could kind of go, they could kind of look at it, and the zoning for, you know, say the blue area isn't set in stone. And, you know, they could look at that and say, like, I have an idea, and then come to the city or whomever, however, and then work out, you know, the zoning from there. So I like that. So I think this is a positive step. So thank you.
Great, appreciate that.
Keep forgetting we're down on number of members. I'm going to back up a little bit. It feels like we're transitioning away from large subdivisions to more infill. Kelly's nodding.
Yeah.
So that whole sense is going to limit to some degree any sort of large scale development, planned unit development or otherwise. Anyway, I think that's where we are. I don't think we're to the point of tear downs like they're doing in Bellevue. Just an editorial comment. The House Bill 111 diagram you have on page 11, the boxes, I think is an excellent way to communicate in your public outreach, because people are going to be really nervous about that bill, and that step down in, okay, this is what could be, and then you get down to that little tiny box, you know, and if you put numbers with it, maybe even better, I don't know. But speaking of numbers, and this kind of now segues to the future land use map, is really like the concept of a future land use map, particularly for its implications with future planning and not having to update the comp plan if there's some zoning changes and that sort of thing. I think could be a wonderful tool. The flip side is not too much detail. I mean, you know, when you're doing public outreach, the first thing a person's going to say is, well, what does it mean for me? And they're going to go to the map and try to find their little piece of the world and see how it's going to possibly impact them. So keeping that step back at a higher vision level, I think, you know, is a balance between the amount of detail you provide and the amount of fuzziness, I guess, because it's not the zoning map. It's conceptual. And I know that's sometimes hard to get across. But nonetheless, I think the idea of having a future land use map is a really good planning tool. Now I have to go back to Jeff. What was the second question?
The first one was, what do you see as the role? And I think you kind of, and the second one was just if you have any general input on anything specific that we've shown.
Yeah, I don't have any future or any more comments on the future land use map. But of course, you can always have separate maps for sensitive areas and new CIP projects, and you know, you don't have to put it all in one map. I think that's all I have. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I love the future land use map. So let's start with that, right? It's fantastic. If you ask me what's my favorite thing, the fact that you put in wildlife bridges is fantastic. And this is a problem that has been tackled by tackled as a new problem in many cities, and the fact that we're already talking about it makes it sound like we are getting ahead of the curve when it comes to having wildlife bridges. So that's fantastic too. So lots of things to love about this. To your second question of what is the input that I would have for it, I was hoping we would see something about schools in this. I do see in the community assets you have in the grid, you have a schools thing. I could tag that there are 2 public schools, public high schools that service this area. I don't see how it will remain as 2. We are going to have a situation where we'll have a 3rd or a 4th one come up. And if that's the case, where would that be? Would be a very natural question that'll come to all the parents and the people who are here, especially when we are considering a 10% growth over the next 20 years, right? And if that's the case, I would like to see at least options of where we would have something like that as a high school. Not so much of the elementary or the middle schools, but high schools are a factor of concern.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think we've been coordinating with the school district, and we'll continue to. We've had an initial meeting with them, and they seem interested in our process. And I think it's appropriate if we want to identify some sites that are suitable for schools. Again, understanding that zoning is going to allow a range of uses, and we don't want to do anything that inhibits the school district's ability to do their good work either. So something that we'll continue to coordinate with them. And we did have the schools noted on the existing flume, but did not have them on the future one, so we could add those back in.
Yeah, because in the absence of that, what happens is that then it becomes, and now I'm going off from policy into politics, where it goes into, instead of having a plan, we will start doing levies and handling levies and all of those things, and it throws even planning into it throws a wrench into everything in planning and all of those details. So we can get ahead of it by identifying some areas where this is, especially now that we are talking of this city growing up to being almost on the verge of being 75,000. So that's one suggestion that I have. The second suggestion that I had was that, or not even suggestion, it was a question that I had, was that if you were to have senior centers, or if there was like a religious establishment, is that what we should consider as a mixed-use center? So I was looking at the mixed-use center and thinking, oh, is this where we are going to have, like if we say that, like Redmond, we have to have a senior center over here, then that's where we would do that? Or am I reading it wrong on the map?
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think there might be areas that we identify for those kind of civic uses as being maybe more of an ideal location, like the town center. But certainly we would want to consider both residential and commercial uses, which is, I think, probably the most common interpretation of the term mixed use, but it could include, other uses. So yeah, and then we could, differentiate those between the centers themselves. And I do think there is an important question of, what is the role of the town center versus the other centers? And in particular, how does the town center relate to Inglewood? So we can, keep them the same or differentiate on the range of uses. And we can have policies that say, for example, having your city hall in your downtown can be an important thing. So we might identify some policies that, hey, when we're citing a public building, here's the locations where we'd like to do it. So we can definitely get more specific on that as well.
Got it. And I do like that it's a little obscure, but I also love the option that we could, if you get to drill through. So you're going to get a maybe if you ask for a vote on that from me, because I love both options. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
All right. Great comments, everybody. Thank you. Yeah, this is good. I'll echo what everybody said about the benefits in liking the future land use map. It does help to illustrate a few things. And one is This will be a question too, but clearly when you look at this, there is a center of development around town center. And I personally think that's probably a good thing. And we could, if you will, sell it by saying we could keep more of the tree canopy elsewhere. There's more density in the center. And I suspect that's true. The flip side is that area around 228th is already very busy and could be a slow go at times. So one of the things that we'll need to consider, and I'm sure it'd be part of the comprehensive plan at some point, is around transportation. And so one of the things we might be able to illustrate in other maps, if you will, is what type of transportation improvements would be put in place so that concerns that our residents have about just getting from point A to point B, quickly enough would kind of get mitigated. That, okay, we've got density around town center. Here's how we're going to address traffic concerns there. And just, I think one or two, just this clarifying question. So I see the wildland urban interface. Is that like proposed or existing? Because the reason I'm asking is there's a lot of sort of pretty wild areas on the slopes that head down to Lake Sammamish and sort of the west side of 228th that feel kind of as much wild land as what's sitting over on the east side. So why is that designated as wildland urban versus some of the other areas that are pretty wild too?
Yeah, it's an official piece of data that we acquired and just mapped, so we didn't make any of the designations ourselves.
So from King County, who hasn't actually been to that.
And I can add, really, it's a consideration of wildfire risk, and so it's residential areas near wilder areas of more dense vegetation, and so there's a category and mapping process, I think, done by the county and the state to identify these areas of potentially higher risk due to higher vegetation and a mix of residential. So there's guidance of, during the comp plan process, of carefully planning adding density in the WUI, wild urban interface. So it's there as a consideration of has been identified as a higher wildfire risk.
Interesting. Okay.
And
that's a great clarification. I appreciate that.
I will just add, this is a new requirement under House Bill 1181, which was that the land use element will need to identify our WUI as that data is provided by the Department of Natural Resources. And a lot of that strategic planning is happening at the county level right now. So that is why you see that on this map. And it's actually a really good tool to know we really shouldn't be developing an area that has higher risk for wildfire.
No, absolutely. Although it is interesting because, there are definitely some areas closer to Lake Sammamish that feel as wild and as at risk. So however they're doing that analysis and evaluation is, it's interesting. I might not agree with all of it. Hey, just one or two other things. So this is separate from the flume, but goes back to the rest of the presentation. I think it's important that just we reiterate, because I know there'll be questions and concerns about the development and the ability to have the affordable units built out with planning for 2100. And so I think it makes sense to just spend a moment talking about how the other pieces of the comprehensive plan will start to flow together and the extent that we're going to be planning, say, transportation for 2100 when we know that we may end up with more units and so forth. So if you could just, kind of summarize that a little bit for myself and maybe the rest of the commission and the public as well.
Yeah, so a great question, and again, something we talked about today and starting to kickstart some of that. So, one of the pieces is to go through a policy review for each of the elements, and that'll be something that we'll be bringing back to you. We've been working on a template for that work, and we did agree that we would start with, a review of all the policies that are in the existing plan, and then make recommendations for changes, new policies, things like that. And then, once we solidify which essentially has been provided to us through PSRC, our growth or land assumptions of the 2,100 units, we will be meeting with the team that's working on the transportation element, and they will be doing some analysis, looking at growth of the 2,100 units with some assumptions around distribution within the city. And then that will inform the policies for the transportation element, as well as the capital project list, which is another really important requirement of the Growth Management Act. We need to be able to demonstrate that we can serve the 2,100 units with urban services and other amenities, things like parks and obviously utilities, so on and so forth. So that's a really important part, and we'll be coordinating with the Public Works Department on that. The parks element, another one where they need to account for the amount of growth that we're going to assume for the 20-year period. A lot of these facilities have what's called a level of service. So we want a certain amount of something per the population or whatever the metric is. And so we do an analysis to see how much we need to accommodate the 2,100 units and the associated population. This can then feed into things like impact fees, based on your capital facilities plan. There's opportunities to look at incentives for affordable housing on the sort of financial side. So relief on things like parking, impact fees, streamlined permitting. There are some other kind of potential barriers that we could look at. May not overcome the biggest barrier of, expensive land costs, but there are some things that we could look at in that regard. Those will eventually feed into the draft elements, and we're proposing to keep the same format as the existing comp plan. So there'll be a volume 1 element for each one that will be sort of a higher level review of some key information and all of the goals and policies. And then the background document in volume 2 will have a lot more of the technical information. And then, that will move through the adoption process along with a suite of development regulations that will be necessary to put in place to meet the mandates. And that will all be packaged together and adopted ideally by the city at the end of next year.
Yeah. So we've got a lot of work ahead of us, don't we?
We do, but this is really the hardest part. A lot of it is front loaded. I mean, yes, there's details to figure out how to make it all work and ensure that new development contributes positively to the community. Sure. But the land use element is really foundational. And, if we're able to kind of have clarity, then we're in really good shape. There are cities that are just starting the process now. So,
okay. All right. Well, we should move on to public comment for agenda items.
Thank you.
Anybody on the?
All right, we have one hand raised, Mr. Stickney. I'm going to promote you to panelist.
Hello, planning commissioners. Paul Stickney, Sammamish. I think I'm the only one tonight because Mary is traveling back to Sammamish. So I've got the solo public comment tonight. Lots of good questions and comments from everyone tonight. Appreciate the updates in the staff report and Jeff Arango from the city council presentation a few weeks ago. It was helpful to hear those understandings. Interesting to learn whatever that new term was that Kelly Hildy said about the fire overlay we have to have. I didn't know anything about that. So lots of good information shared. And thank you all for that. A couple comments about some of the things that were said tonight. Klahani, annexed in 2016, had just under 4,000 housing units and roughly 11,000 people. I thought that would be a helpful little snippet of information. I'm looking over at my notes here as I chat. And I have a little different view on the housing types. I think it would be interesting to add stacked flats back, but not so much for everywhere, but more for if neighborhoods want to have a little diversity within them, sort of their choice for a place that maybe has a, you know, a small restaurant or cafe or you know, tavern or just some types of uses. 2 or 3 stories of horizontal condominium development could make sense, especially if it's done architecturally well. If you think about Trossachs, there is a neighborhood of 2 or 3 story condos there. There's a couple of those projects near Southeast 8th, east of 244th, Vintage, you know, Bordeaux, I think those are called. Those can actually be some pretty good looking projects and provide some affordable housing that looks good and is walkable. So I'm not sure a lot of the city would want that type of thing, but it might be a good tool to keep in the toolbox for a little diversification within neighborhoods, if the neighborhoods choose to. Now, a little bit of a fireside chat, a short version. I'd like to talk with each of you longer about this. And before I jump into the fireside chat, I'd like to suggest something. In June of 2018, I believe I took a look. I didn't know this off the top of my head. On June 8th or on June 6th, there was an industry panel that came to Sammamish. I highly suggest that you watch that presentation. It was about 2 hours at a planning commission meeting. June 6th of 2018. Really important concept, hangs together with some of the things I'm going to chat with you about here. And then also suggest that you take a look at the late 2017 to mid 2018 update of the Sammamish Housing Strategy Plan that was called Sammamish Homegrown. And then take a look at the meetings from the fall of 18 into early 19 and how the city council made radical alterations to what a unanimous you know, planning commission recommendation was. I think that's a good thing to sneak a peek at. Also be aware that roughly 85% of the housing stock in Sammamish was done by King County Planning, both before incorporation and in the pipeline when Sammamish incorporated, and Sammamish has done 15%. Why do I mention that? My fireside chat is going to start with a pizza, around pizza. And I have never been advocating and call that pizza our housing supply and call the circle of a pizza housing for life. I've never been advocating in the years I've been working on this to expand that size, to make the whole bigger. I've been advocating to fill it in. And think if you ordered a pizza and you were excited about it and it showed up at your door and say it was a 12-piece pizza, how would you feel if there were 7 pieces or 8 instead of 12? It just isn't right. It's not whole. So the real issue is a complete reversal in how everything is looked at. How do housing supplies within our community meet and holistically, sustainably, you know, balance out for needs over time? And I assert that we are way behind on that. And where we're headed is going to put us 10 to 15 more years behind. I think there are ways to add to town center and the other centers with very little to no traffic beyond what's already planned for within their FEIS, fewer students, yes, some more people, but with suitable transit and environmental benefit, it's mostly net positive and low impact. And to that end, I'd suggest you take a look at one of the emails I sent today with the Achieving compilation from 2016. Look at the policy in there. Look at the traffic study that shows how through internalization and trip counts, our town center can handle far more units without creating traffic beyond what it's plan for. And I submit that where there's a will, there's a way. And I think that as a community, if we added different diverse and housing types for all income levels, economic, demographic, and workforce group in our centers now, we would attain 75,000, but it would be low impact. So I'm almost out of time, but I suggest that we do plan for the 75 because almost no part of Sammamish is going to have change except our centers, and that is to benefit ourselves by filling in our housing pizza without expanding the size of it. Appreciate the chance to have a chat tonight.
Thanks, Paul, and you made me hungry. Kelly, have any other comments? Anything about the agenda that's coming up?
Nope, I think we covered a lot tonight, and it's a lot to process and digest, and we will be back on the 20th,
yeah.
with the economic development element.
All right, so anybody wish to move to adjourn?
Seconded.
Seconded. Moved and second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Good meeting.